This is my review of Cells at Work Code Black. Okay, so this episode, if you can't tell by the title, is a little bit of a sadder episode, we'll put it. So the main purpose of this episode is to explain stomach ulcers, how they happen, and the dangers they can have on the body. While also, I'll get to it in a minute, but you guys should be able to. But yeah, this episode kind of just ends on a pretty dour and sad note. So I'll get to that in a minute, but it is a little bit sad and tragic. So and I will get to it when I get to it. So it starts off with 2153 and 1677 in the scene they were in the last episode, where 1677 gave 2153 a much needed perspective change on how the body actually works. And the next day, 1677 approaches 2153 and notices that he's got a bit more of a bit pup in his step, I guess you could call it. And 2153 merely remarks that it was because of 1677's pep talk the other day that he was able to finally realize that he doesn't need to work so hard to push himself, and that that's really no big deal, and that he realizes now that he needs to rely on other people just as much as they rely on him. And points out that if it hadn't been for 1677, he would have self-destructed. And 1677 merely brushes it off, pointing out that it's really not that big a deal, and that he shouldn't be so gung-ho about trying to pay up his debts or anything like that. At which point they continue onward with their deliveries and run into one of the younger blood cells that 2153 snapped at last episode. And 2153 understandably goes up to apologize, only for the younger red blood cell to apologize instead, pointing out that he realizes that they put too much work on 2153, and that they pushed him too hard, him trying to show them the ropes, and that they formally apologized for that. And 2153 apologizes back, pointing out that it was kind of a bit more his fault, pointing out that he shouldn't have taken on so many loads at once, and that was ultimately what caused him to go crazy and self-destruct. And as the two kind of reconcile, another red blood cell runs in, pointing out that they need a lot more oxygen that they can, and that there's an emergency summons for them to carry as much oxygen as they can carry. And when 2153 and 1677 ask where they're going, the red blood cell merely responds that they're going to the stomach. And 2153 understandably knows that the stomach is a very rough place to transport oxygen, so if there's an emergency there, then it's probably a very bad thing. And sure enough, they arrive at the stomach and can't help but admire how much work actually goes into maintaining it, pointing out that it's a very dangerous place, and that one slip could be any cell's last, and that they appreciate how much the gastric cells actually work to keep the cell lining intact, so that there's no big problems. At which point the gastric chief cell, who we already met, he yells at them to get back to work, and that they need to go to the emergency briefing, and they apologize for lollygagging and then go to what he has to say. And as he points out, that he's literally going to work them to death, because as it turns out, there's an ulcer in the stomach. And yeah, he explains the danger that if the ulcer isn't taken care of, and they don't deliver as much oxygen as the red blood cells can carry, that eventually they're not going to be able to repair the ulcer, and the ulcer is eventually going to destroy the stomach and the rest of the body along with it. So yeah, that's why the stomach's a little bit scary. If it develops an ulcer, then it's very likely that the gastric acid that's normally supposed to be inside the stomach could leak out and cause irreparable damage. It's kind of scary when you think about it. You just have this little organ full of acid just sitting in the middle of your body, and if it ruptures at any point, it'll just leak everywhere and just take you with it. It's very scary to think about, actually. But at which point 2153 raises his hand and asks the gastric chief cell what exactly is going on and what caused the ulcer. And the gastric chief cell merely responds that basically what happened is that that in addition to a bunch of food and a bunch of other things that aren't good for him, which have caused digestion to go bad, there is also something that the gastric chief cell only refers to as him, and that they really need to be careful treading their feet. At which point the red blood cells proceed to go onward, and they believe that the gastric chief cell is just bluffing. And 1677 even asks 2153 if he thinks it was a joke. But 2153 is openly against the idea, pointing out that Gastric Chief Cell isn't the kind of guy to make jokes. He's a very serious, straightforward person, and is very serious due to his nature living in the stomach. And sure enough, as they're walking, the stomach ruptures a little bit, and gastric acid leaks out and onto the red blood cells in front of 2153 and 1677, and they naturally run like hell and get into a safe place. At which point, the gastric chief cell runs in, saves the red blood cells, or at least to the extent that he can, and then orders the gastric sub chief cells that work under him, as well as the platelets, to patch up the wound so that it stops going everywhere. And they're pretty quick on that front. And 2153 remarks whether or not this happens often, and the gastric chief cell merely remarks that it does, and that if they're not careful, that they could wind up sharing the fate of the red blood cells that were lost because of the gastric acid leaking out. But in any case, 1677 begins to have second doubts and runs off, and the gastric chief cell merely remarks good riddance, because they can't really have cowards hanging out in the stomach working because of how dangerous it is. They need as strong-willed people as they can working to deliver oxygen and a whole bunch of other things. But 2153 merely remarks to himself that he's not so sure that's the case, because as he points out, 1677 has been working hard alongside 2153 up to this point, and can't imagine that he's actually going off to cower. But indeed, that's exactly what he is, pointing out that he works on being a coward, but not being a coward anymore. But he's still scared that any moment could be his last. But as he's working, he suddenly sees the white blood cells that we've seen going toward the stomach, and realizes something is wrong. And then again, when a larger group of red blood cells continue to gather, and he decides that he needs to face his fears and go back to work at the stomach. And sure enough, he does. As the other red blood cells are working, 2153 nearly slips and drops some of his oxygen, and 1677 catches it and hands it back to him. At which point, 1677 points out that he was just kind of hiding in a capillary, wait to slack off for a little bit, which 2153 appreciates. But as they're preparing to work, they suddenly see something in the stomach that isn't supposed to be there, and as it turns out, that's what the gastric chief cell actually referred to as him. As it turns out, there's an aged pylori in the stomach, and we've already seen what it does thanks to the original cells at work. And it has a little bit of a redesign here. It looks more like a giant kaiju monster than it does an actual bacterium. But the idea behind it is that this thing is actually the cause of the stomach ulcer. Because of the way it works to actually make the stomach inhabitable for itself. The H. pylori actually causes irreparable damage to the stomach just by virtue of it existing. It neutralizes the gastric acid, which it then rips open, tears holes in the stomach lining just because it's moving around, doing things that it should in the stomach. At which point the white blood cells intervene and try to take it down. And 2153 and 6 resolves that they need to continue delivering oxygen. And 1677 is reluctant on that, pointing out that it's pretty dangerous, but also realizing that they can't really loiter around in the stomach if things are going crazy. And so while the white blood cells are actually dealing with the H. pylori, they decide to continue delivering oxygen to the best of their ability, and they do. They keep running through the stomach, delivering oxygen wherever they can. But at one point, as they're continuing on their route, 2153 actually gets hit by some stomach acid that burst out of the stomach, and he loses a bit of feeling in his leg. He has a bit of a hard time standing. But 1677 merely picks him up, pointing out that he needs to be more careful. and to tell 2153 that if anything goes south for him, that he'll rely on 1677 to help him, because 2153 is reluctant to stop working. He has a bad leg now, but he'll be fine, I think, at least according to himself. And in any case, they continue working onward. At which point they come across a corridor that's slowly eroding. And the H. pylori is, by virtue of existing, has started to destroy more of the stomach and causing more gastric acid to leak out. At which point the gastric chief cell shows up and remarks that they need to hurry and get to safety, or they're going to fall in. And they do. They run to where gastric chief cell, but as they're running, 2153's leg gives out. And 1677 notices that his friend is no longer able to keep up with him, realizes that he's about to fall in, and then he pulls 2153 to safety while falling into the pit himself and dies. So, yeah, 1677 dies in this episode. He just straight up falls into the stomach and dies that way. And yeah, it's very tragic. It's very tragic, and 2153 is very upset about the fact that his friend fell in, because 2153 just goes completely hysterical from this point onward. He continues to put pressure the rest of the cells into trying to let him actually go and save 1677, even though it's too late, and even when gastric chief cell tells him it's too late. And even as they're closing up the wound, as the platelets are closing up the wound, he still continues to try and push his way through, trying to get back to 1677 and save him. But eventually the gastric chief cell grabs him by the shoulders, pointing out that death is a daily occurrence in the stomach, and he shouldn't get so sentimental. At which point he pushes him aside into a wall, and 2153's glasses fall off. And they continue to work on the stomach to close up the wounds. At which point 2153 basically just has a meltdown. He remembers all of the good times he had with 1677, is completely distressed over the fact that his closest friend is now dead, and just lets it all out. He cries heavily and is completely consumed by grief. And meanwhile the white blood cells aren't having a very good time. 1196 points out that they're having a very rough time actually defeating the H. pylori, and that it just won't go down. But as they're contemplating what their next move should be, an antibiotic actually shows up in the stomach, a special one designed to take down H. pyloris. I forget specifically what the antibacterium is called, but it looks like a giant robot in this version of it. And it takes down and it does take down the H. pylori and finally destroys it. Although gastric chief cell remarks that the H. pylori can't die fast enough for him. At which point one of the sub-chief cells asks gastric chief cell if things will go back to normal, but gastric chief cell merely remarks that it's going to be the same as always, because even in a code black environment, they're never going to actually have a break. It's always going to be a rough situation in the body, and they're going to just have to deal with that and take it as they can. At which point, but in any case, after that whole dilemma with the H. pylori is over, the 1196 and her white blood cell friends continue going through the hallway, assessing their job well done, and they see 2153 walking in the hallway past them, and they greet him and say hello and tell him and thank him for all his hard work, and he just kind of blows them off and doesn't see them at all. And at which point 1196 realizes something is wrong, and even notices that 2153's glasses are on the floor, and picks them up, and realizing that he didn't pick them up, she quickly realizes something is the matter. And sure enough, as we find out at the end of the episode, 2153 doesn't want to work as a red blood cell anymore. All he does is hang out in his apartment, blowing off work and resolving himself to just grieve and never come back. So yeah, and I can't really say I blame him. His friend died in front of him. I can't really say I blame him here. He had his closest friend throughout the entire series just kind of fell into the stomach and died, and he is not okay. It's very clear that 2153 is not going to be okay for a long time. But yeah, that just begs the question of where 2153's story is going to go. I mean, yeah, he's grieving, but there's the but is he going to get over his grief and actually continues to stop working, or is he going to eventually go back to work despite his grief? That's the interesting thing, because he has lost a close friend today. He lost a close friend the other day. He's not going to be okay for a while. So yeah, it's gonna be a rough day or two. But I hope he can actually pull through and get through it, because I know grief. Grief is tough, and especially when you see the person die in front of you. It's a very sad, heartbreaking thing. Yeah, like for example, the other day, I know for personal experience, because very recently, we had to put my dog down, and she's no longer with us. But yeah, we had to put her down because she was just in a state where she was no longer able to live with us. And yeah, it's a very sad, very heartbreaking thing. I understand from personal experience that it's very rough to deal with grief, but for 2153's sake, I hope he can actually push through it and continue to work, because sometimes that's the only thing you can do. Just push past it and just work hard. And I hope he's able to do that. But in any case, yeah, that's my review of Salsa Work Code Black. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Facebook and on Twitter in the description below. And also, be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It really helps me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks. I'm always saying thanks, so be sure to check those out in the description below as well. Also, if you want to see more videos from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this. The bottom video is the video that is best recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So, if you want to see more stuff that you like, then be sure to check that out as well. But regardless of whether or not you do any or all of those things, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!